first read about yoga in my, I think, 10th year in high school on my own. I grew up in Ohio on a farm. In my early mid-teens, I began to more actively seek answers to questions that I had, and began to read books taken from the public library. And I read Theo Spinarri's book on Hatha Yoga, and one of Paul Brunton's books, Research in Secret India. I had, from the book on Hatha Yoga, learned to do some of the Hatha Yoga routines and tried to meditate without any appreciable success, although I had a pronounced religious aspiration, and because I had grown up going to church on a regular basis, a fundamental church. And then when I was 18, my senior year in high school, I got sick. I had rheumatic fever. I was confined to bed for 5 months. I realized I had to make some changes in my life. I deepened my prayer life. I read nutrition magazines, which I had collected, trying to find some routine for restoring my body to wellness. And while reading one of the nutrition books, Bernard McFadden's magazine, Physical Culture, which was published in that era, I saw an ad for Autobiography of a Yogi. And I had seen the ad before, but had not responded earlier. Well, I ordered the book through the mail, and it arrived, and I read it. And I was just fascinated by the book and the photos of the saints, especially the Guru line. And I resolved right then that I must meet Master, and I felt that he was my Guru. And so when I got well, later that summer, and then through the summer went through convalescing and getting my strength back, I was holding in my mind this idea of going to California, wondering how to arrange it. I didn't have any money. But in November of that year, I left home and I hitchhiked. First I went to Florida, thinking that I would earn some money and then go to California. And I worked as a fry cook for 2 weeks, and then I tried to sell magazines from door to door for 2 or 3 weeks, and that was not so good. And then I hitchhiked from Tampa, Florida to Los Angeles. And I arrived just a few days before Christmas. I spent the first day upon my arrival at the Los Angeles Public Library in the religion philosophy section, getting up my courage to go to Mount Washington and thinking about how will I make my approach. I think I might have sent a postcard along the way to say that I'm coming, but I had no clear communication on the matter. I had taken the SRF lessons earlier that summer. Up to lesson 30, I think I learned the Hong Saw and the energization exercises. And it's true. And I remember when I got ready to go out to Mount Washington, it was in the evening, and about 4:30, and I asked someone the general direction to Highland Park area, and I was informed that I should go down here on Spring Street and get a streetcar going that direction. And then I got down to the recommended place, and I was curious about how far it would Highland Park was from where I was. And there was a liquor store on the corner, and I went in and I asked the proprietor, and he said, about 7 miles that way. And I thanked him and went out and picked up my suitcase and started walking because I didn't have any money. I left Tampa 10 days earlier with $5, and so at this time I didn't have any money, not even a dime for the streetcar. And he came out and he said, where are you going? And I told him. He said, oh, here. He said, here's a dime for the streetcar fare. And so I got to the foot of the Mount Washington and started walking up the road, and a man stopped in his car and asked where I was going, and he said, "I'm going right by there, I'll drop you off." So he dropped me off at the gate, and the first person I met when I arrived in Mount Washington was Ralph Sherman. He was at the gatehouse at the time. House is not there anymore, and Ralph took me over to the boys' kitchen, men's kitchen, then underneath the main building. And my timing was good because it was dinner time. You remember that? Thank goodness. And I was introduced to some of the fellows who were there, and to Kriyananda. And then I remember Kriyananda asked me during the dinner interlude to meet him afterwards up on the ground floor, the main entrance room of the building. And we were up there talking, and he was inquiring about my background and what brought me there and so on. And I don't know to this day whether it was rigged that we should be there, or did Master just show up? Did he tell you to be there?
No, it was done just impromptu.
But I remember we were sitting there talking, and all of a sudden Swami stood up. He said, "Oh, Master's coming." And I learned later the signal was the elevator. We could hear the elevator coming down. And Master came out, followed by, was it Diamata and Virginia? There were 2 or 3 with him, and he was on his way out to his car that was parked out in the driveway. And I wish I could tell you that his first words were, "My son, at last you have come." But I remember he was dressed in his overcoat and his white scarf around his neck. And his first words were, "How old are you?" And he shook my hand and he said, "How old are you?" And I said, 18, sir. And then his next question was, "Do your parents know you've come?" And I said, "Well, it's all right." And then there were just a few words that passed, and then he touched me on the forehead and said, "I'll see you again," and he went out to the car.
But I could tell he was very pleased to meet you.
It was a good meeting, wasn't it? And then Kriyananda took me over to the boys' dorm, and they found a little bed over in the corner of that building. And the next day was the Christmas season meditation. And so it was marvelous timing, because for months now I had been dreaming of being with Master and living this life and so on. And the very next day was the all-day meditation in the chapel at Mount Washington headquarters. And I remember I was there at the scheduled time, and people were standing out in the main room because Master had not yet come down. And he was late that morning. I remember he was late coming down. And finally, when he came down, St. Lune was with him, and they walked very quietly into the chapel and sat, and then the rest of us went in, and we were directed to our seats. And I believe that meditation for that day only went about 6 hours, with the break in the midpoint. But of course there was Master talking, and there was chanting, and interludes for quiet meditation, and then more talking by Master, and then chanting, and then quiet time, then a break. And then that went on into the afternoon. And then the next day was, I remember, was the down at Hollywood Church. It was on a Sunday. And after the Sunday service, Master talked that morning. And after the Sunday service, one of the sisters of the order came. I was outside on the grounds, and she said, "Master wants to see you later when he's seen everyone else." And Master reserved after the service to visit with people and interview people. And so later that afternoon, after everyone had been taken care of, I was invited in to be with Master. And he was sitting in the little waiting room just off the stage at the Hollywood Temple on a little couch. And when I came in, he motioned me to sit beside him. And he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked, what can I do for you? And I managed to say that I wanted to be his disciple. And he said, how is your health? And I said, all right, as far as I know. And then he said, let's see. And he reached out with his hand and felt my pulse. And it was years later that I learned about pulse diagnosis, but I'm sure he could have known just directly without that touch. But he felt my pulse, and then he said, oh, you're all right. And then we talked a few minutes, and he said, you know, this is not a path of escapism. And he said, you stay. And so it was arranged, and I stayed there at Mount Washington. I entered into the routine. I did a variety of things. I swept the driveways and raked the lawns, and I worked 1 or 2 weeks, I remember, in the office supervised by Swami at that time, putting out the form letters for the correspondence course. 1 week, 1 or 2 weeks, I worked out at the lake shrine on the hill, digging down, helping to dig down some of the dirt from on the hill to slope the hill behind where now the gold domes are. And during that phase, I remember, during that interlude, when I would sit to meditate, and even when I was out there working, when I would pause for a little rest between, the digging and shoveling, I would feel, without any thought beforehand, I would feel this electric surge go up my spine. It would just start at the bottom and go like that. And we were sitting, I remember one evening to meditate in the chapel, and I remember Joe Carbone was sitting next to me. And we sat down, and I sat there, and this current came up, just like that, and I went, I didn't make that noise, but it felt like that, you know. And later he said, what are you doing? And I explained what the sensation was, and then he said, oh, that's because you're seeing Master now and then, and you're here in this environment. I didn't know in those days about Kundalini, Shaktipat, the transfer of the current from the Guru to the disciple, and so on. We were fortunate then to see Master quite often. It was very interesting how frequently Master would go out for a walk or go for a drive in the evening and come back. And when he would come, his car would pull into the driveway, some of the monks would be there, almost as though we were summoned. And yet no one said, oh, Master's coming, let's go down and meet him. But several of us would just be there. And we didn't hang out waiting for him to spring on us, surprise him. We'd just be there, and his car would pull in. And he'd open the back door and sit and talk with us. And that was always very nice. I was there about 2 months. And we could pin it down. Swami, do you recall when that year in 50 when they poured the foundation for India House?
I don't remember the month, no. I think it was...
Early spring.
I think it was early spring. I was out in the desert at that
time. Oh, okay. But this was just before he went to the desert.
No, then it would have been January.
Okay, because...
Just because I helped pour it, I remember.
Okay. Well, I was down there.
They did it all by hand in those days. They didn't have trucks come.
Well, the trucks came, but we had to pound the walls, I remember, put the vibrators down in the...
Yeah. But I remember mixing, maybe the foundations, I remember mixing it. I'd have to throw the cement in.
Is that right?
Yeah.
You were on a different project. They were pouring, they were pouring the walls. Remember the walls?
And they had trucks then?
Yeah.
I
think you were doing the footings, the preliminary work.
That may be it.
Yeah.
Because then maybe after that I was in the desert. Okay.
But the day they poured the walls, at the end of the day, Reverend Bernard, one of the senior ministers at the time, came out. And he looked the situation over, and then he came over to me and he said, Master wants to see you tonight at 7 o'clock. You be down by the men's kitchen. So we went back to Mount Washington, and I showered. We had our evening meal, and the other fellows went to wherever they wherever they wanted to go or had to go. And I sat there from 7 till about 11:30. And Master didn't show up. No one showed up. And by 11:30 I was tired and sleepy, and I wasn't depressed, I was just a little confused. But I was mainly tired, and I thought, well, maybe something happened, and I went to the boys' dorm and to sleep. The next morning, Bill Brown, one of the fellows, said, "Oh, Master came in about 12, and the first thing he did when he got here was he asked about you. And I offered to come and get you, but he said, no, I'll see him tomorrow." So the next day, Bernard tracked me down and said, "Master wants to see you tonight at 7 o'clock, the same place." And so that night I was there and resolved to stay there. And I was there till about 10:30, same story. And then all of a sudden there was a flurry of activity, and his car was brought to the entrance of the basement of the building. Luggage was brought down, disciples showed up and lined the hallway, and Master was going to go to the desert. His 29 Palms, and after a while, word came down that he's not going tonight. Put the car away. So the disciples went back to their rooms, and the car was put away, and I was all by myself again. And then I heard the elevator come down, and the door opened, and Master stuck his head out. I remember that. He was dressed to go out for a walk. He had his overcoat on and his felt hat, and he stuck his head out, and he looked, and he said, "There's my boy." And he said, "Follow me," and he took me to Reverend Bernard's room just a few feet away and knocked on the door. He wasn't. If there was a buzzer on the door, I never saw him use it. He pounded on the door. And he called Bernard, and Bernard opened the door, and there was another fellow in there, Cliff Fredericks. And Master was eating some blanched almonds, and I didn't have any judgment, but I noticed that because he had said a few days earlier in just conversation with some disciples that we should eat the natural almonds, and only a few would chew them very well. And here he had the blanched almonds. I guess it was left over from the Christmas season. And I happened to glance at him, and he said, "Oh, first thing I've had to eat all day." And over in his left hand, and his right hand was free, and he said, "Kneel down." And I knelt, and he said, Shri Teswar said to me, when he accepted me, he said to me, "No matter what you do or fail to do, I pledge you my unconditional love." He said, "Now I tell you that whatever you do or fail to do, I will pledge you my unconditional love. Can you pledge that same love to me?" And I was getting sort of filled up at this time, and I said, "Yes, sir." And he had me stand up. And then he said, will you do what I ask?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "I want you to go to Phoenix. We have a project there." And so the next day I was on the train going to Phoenix, Arizona. And the project was a goat dairy. That Herbert Freed, who was only a year or two older than myself, but was the minister at Phoenix, had gotten this idea of a business project that would bring in money for the center activity and serve as a working environment for some of the male monastics. And so St. Linda put the money up, and they had purchased 5 acres out in Scottsdale, about 10 miles out of Phoenix, and it had 25 goats on the property, and a milk house to process the milk, to pasteurize it, small shed, and one little cottage for living quarters, and that was it. Well, I had grown up on a farm, and so I knew how to work with animals. Besides, when the master said, "I want you to go to Phoenix," he said, "We have a project there." Then he said, "Besides, the climate will be good for your health." So he sent me over there. And I met Herbert, and Herbert just told me this wonderful tale about how much money we were going to make and how the how the business was going to expand, and how Master would be pleased, and St. Lin would be happy. And so I lived out at the dairy for a year. And I won't go into the details on that, but it was obvious that we couldn't make any money with 25 goats. So Herbert arranged for St. Lin to buy some more, so we had 125 goats, and we had to build adobe brick barns to house them, the extra ones, and so we scheduled the breedings that we'd always have 60 or 70 milking at peak production capacity. And so it was marvelous that first year, you know, get up early in the morning, meditate for an hour or so, get up and feed and milk the goats, and then do whatever had to be done on the property, irrigating the pasture and doing maintenance work and so forth. And then in the evening, again, the milking and the feeding routine. And then after that, 3 or 4 hours of meditation. That's when I got into deeper meditation on my own. At Mount Washington, as Prajnanananda was the supervisor of the men's activities, we had our morning and evening meditations, and then we were encouraged to meditate on our own during private time. But over there was where I had the opportunity to experiment with longer meditations at night, 3 and 4 hours. And I would meditate until I couldn't stay awake, really. I'd meditate until sleep would overtake me, then I would lie down and rest. And Master told me that he wanted me to come to see him at least every 60 days at first. So every 2 months I would come to California, bring the bus over from Phoenix, and he was at 29 Palms, so I would stop at Banning and take the limousine out to 29 Palms. And there was a cottage out there just a few miles from where Master lived, where I would stay. But during the day, I would be taken over to Master's place, the property where he lived. And there were 2 houses there. Prajnananda probably has told you about the facility. And sometimes help out on the ground. Sometimes there wasn't much to do, or sometimes just be there. But always in the evening, if the weather was good, Master would come out for a walk, and he would invite me and others sometimes, but if others weren't there, just me, to go for a walk around the perimeter of the grounds, and that was always nice to do. If the weather was cold, he would invite me into the living room of his house to talk. And so those were the intimate times I had with Master. They weren't very long in duration. And then I would come over, of course, to California for the special events, the dedications of the various shrines and temples, and also for the Kriya service, the convocations, and Master's birthday, Christmas meditation, and so on. But I remember walking with Master the first year, walking with Master around his property at 29 Palms, and I wasn't very outgoing, and I used to like to hear him talk. I preferred him to tell me things rather than, I didn't want to just talk, ask questions, and I certainly had nothing to say, original. And we were walking, and he said, "Do you have any questions?" And a thought came to mind. I had been wondering. And I asked him, how many of the masters mentioned in your book, Autobiography of a Yogi, are liberated? And he said, he didn't pause, he said, "Oh, not many." He said, "Many saints are content to be absorbed in the ecstasy of God communion and don't aspire to anything beyond that, don't aspire to the higher state." And it was interesting how, to me, even then, how quick he would answer, and to the point, and as though he expected you to understand. You have that experience too. He would just tell you. He wouldn't say, "Oh, you couldn't understand if I explained it." He never said that to me. He would just tell you straight out. So those were marvelous times. to be with him alone. And then when the goat dairy was closed down, I was transferred to Phoenix to be the sort of an apprentice under Herbert and maintain the grounds and maintain the buildings. And I remember the Sunday Bob came, and Herbert did go with him over to California. I saw Master a few weeks before he passed. Well, I'll back up just a little bit. I was ordained. Bob mentioned how he was ordained. I was ordained by Master personally in the autumn of 1951. I was 20 years of age. I was not yet 21. There had been no prior discussion of this. I assumed that eventually I would be a representative of the Guru line, but that was in my mind, but there was no formal planning and so, no discussion of the matter. I was just there to work and to meditate and to be with Master and to let things unfold. I was visiting Mount Washington with Herbert on one occasion in the autumn of '51, and we were scheduled, we had been there a few days, we were scheduled to depart on a certain day. The night before, we happened to be at the entrance of Mount Washington, the main building, when Master came in. Several monks were there. And Master stopped and talked with us. And then he said to Herbert and myself, he said, you two come with me. And we went with him up the elevator to the 3rd floor. And he sat in a chair just outside the room where he used to have interviews with people, in the hallway. And Herbert stood in front of him, and I stood to one side. And he asked questions about the Phoenix Center and the people there he knew, and gave us some pointers on what to do there. And addressing most of his comments to Herbert, who was the minister then. And then he paused, and I could always tell when he was going to terminate our time together. There was that pause. And then just out of the blue, he turned to me. He said, kneel down. So I knelt by his chair. He put his hands on my head. And he said, I ordain you a minister of self-realization. Heal, teach as I have taught, heal as I have healed, and initiate devotees into Kriya Yoga. And that was how quick it was, just like that. And I remember Herbert standing right in front of him and said, sir, is Roy to initiate into Kriya Yoga? No, I took it at that time that he meant in the future, not immediately, you know. And, but Herbert asked, oh, is Roy to initiate into Kriya Yoga? And Master said, you too, the same God who is in me is in you. What I have done, you should do. I remember his direct words. And then it was just after his memorial service in March of '52 that Dayamata presented me with the paperwork certificate signed by Rajasi and Sister Durga, Florina Darling. 2 days after, it was dated 2 days after Master passed, because my birthday is March 9, and I was then 21, and I could not be legally ordained in California until my 21st birthday. But Master passed on the 7th of March. I had seen him a few weeks prior to that at the desert retreat. I remember I went into his living room in his house, and he was sitting in this big reclining chair that St. Lin had given him for either a Christmas or a birthday present a year or two before. And he was just bubbling. And he said, I finished the Gita. I remember that. He said, I finished the Gita. He said, a little while ago, he said, I was just here resting with my eyes closed, and in the spiritual eye I saw this gold light. And I opened my eyes, and I saw that light, and he pointed about where the ceiling and the wall came together. He said, I saw it right there. And he said, Babaji, Paramahansa, and Sri Yukteswar came and smiled their blessings. They were so happy that I finished the book. And then we talked for a little while, and he told me, he said, you go all the way in this lifetime. That's the way he talked to me, and I'm sure he talked to others here the same way. He never said to me, if you work hard, if you're diligent, you'll come back next time in a good environment and get a good start, on spiritual growth. No, he said, you go all the way in this time. He said, when Sri Yukteswar, before Sri Yukteswar passed, and he told me how Sri Yukteswar had trembled a little bit at the thought of his impending transition. As I think he referred to it in the autobiography, Yukteswar's words, that sometimes even a caged bird is reluctant to leave the cage even when the door is open because they've grown accustomed to the cage. He said Sri Yukteswar used to say, the boat that carries souls across the river of delusion is ready to depart. Who will go? Who will go? If no one goes, I will go. You be like that. And that's the way he talked to me. So that was the last time I saw him in the flesh. And then on March 7th, I was in Phoenix, and Herbert was over here in California. Herbert spent quite a bit of time with Master the day before Master passed. Did you drive the car that day when he went out to the lake shrine? With Frederick Clifford that day. And that night, Herbert called me and said, Master passed this evening. He told me a few details. And he said, you call the members and have a memorial service for the members there, and then come for the service here, which is what I did. And then after the memorial service, Dayamata said, it's Master's wish that Herbert come and be with us here in California, and you be the minister there at Phoenix. So that's what I did. But I never had the extensive training at Mount Washington. Prajnananda is probably and one or two other fellows I knew. But we didn't have much interaction in those days, personal interaction. I would visit, of course, and I would enter into the program, the scheduled activities when I was there, but I wasn't there that often. And which is all right with me. I mean, I love my brothers, I love Mount Washington, but I have never been one who has needed group support to motivate me and sustain me in my inner work. In fact, when I was at Phoenix, before Master passed and afterwards, my schedule that I chose myself was that I would get up in the morning at 3 and meditate until about 7, and I would meditate for almost an hour at noon, just doing Hong Sam mantra, just centering and watching the breath. And then in the evening from about 7 till 10, sometimes 11, I would meditate. So I did that. And Master never asked me about my spiritual practices when I saw him. He'd look at me and he would say, oh, look how well you're doing. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. And if I wasn't doing so well, which is, I didn't have too many downers, once or twice. If I was a little off course, he would say, I want to talk with you. And then he'd give me a few pointers. It was always encouraging, always encouraging. I was depressed one time because I wasn't enlightened yet. And he reminded me of St. Anthony in the tomb, and how long it took for him to experience that breakthrough. And he said, you be patient now, remember St. Anthony. And he said, he was so simple and direct, he said, life has to be lived anyway, so why not live in the highest way? So he was always so encouraging and supportive. And so my experience with him was very positive, and I don't live in the past, I have the good memories of Master. But he awakened the force in me, and he believed in me, he encouraged me. And I stayed with the organization until the autumn of 1953, and that time I felt I'd grown up on the farm, 18 years on the farm, almost 4 years. In the cloistered environment, I had no experience at all in the secular world, and I thought it was time to leave, and so I did. And so I've been active now all of these years. I was 2 years in the Army, but after that I've been active all of these years teaching. I sometimes say, which is true, I've never held a job in my life. Meaning I've never worked for anyone else. I've always ministered. In the early years, we were lean years, but I learned by doing, to teach and to speak and to write and to serve and to deepen my inner life. And it gets better and better. And Master is as real now as then. In fact, at a deeper level, there's even more real. And the gurus are real. So that's my brief experience and my testimony. So I'm very pleased to be here with you, and especially with Bob and Swamiji and others who I haven't been seen for some time. And it'll be very nice to have fellowship and interaction with you over the weekend. Okay, thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Master used to say from time to time that devotion to God is more important than meditation technique, but that devotion and technique together is an unbeatable combination. He emphasized devotion, he emphasized service, living the life, living the principles. He emphasized deep meditation. Every now and then, with disciples whom he would encounter during an interlude during conversation, he might ask, how are you doing your kriyas, meaning the pranayamas? And then we would have to show him how we were doing, and he might say, all right. Or he would say, no, you do this. I remember one evening he came in from a drive, and several of us were at the entrance of the building, and he was in a very happy mood, and he sent I think it was Faye and Virginia and Mernalini on up to the top floor, and he asked Bill Brown, one of the boys, if we had any food in the men's kitchen. So he went into the kitchen with us on the lower basement floor, and they found him some cornflakes and some milk. Some milk in the refrigerator, and he sat at the table and was having his cereal, and he asked some of the boys how they were doing their kriyas, pranayamas. He just simply said, how are you doing kriyas? And he would watch as they did it. And then I remember he said, oh, to one, he said, oh, no, like this. And he went way down deep and he pulled very strong, like that. And then we got the idea immediately how to do Kriya Pranayama, at least for us in our situation. But I remember on that occasion he spotted a bottle of Tabasco sauce on the shelf, and he asked for that, and he had put some in a spoon, and he sipped that, and we were interested in observing that. And then he put a little bit in the spoon, and he said, "Line up, boys." So we had to combine, each take a little sip. And it was interesting. He didn't overdo it. It was enough just to give us a challenge, you know. But Master always told me, and when I was in Phoenix, I would visit from Phoenix, and he told Herbert too. He used to say, he used American colloquial expressions from time to time. He used to say about working with the devotees at the Phoenix Center, he used to say, dye them in the wool of Kriya Yoga when you meditate with them. He said nothing will take the place of that. And then, of course, he reiterated his oft-quoted statement that church is the hive and God is the honey. And a center for activity, church activity, without the honey of God is of little value. As far as he was concerned, he admitted the social usefulness of mainline churches. He acknowledged that. But his emphasis was realization and realization. And he didn't say, to me at least, or anyone that I heard him talk with, that if we were steady on the path, we would be realized in some future incarnation. There is always that possibility. If you don't awaken completely, you can continue your growth in the astral and causal realms and take on a new body, identify with a new body. I hesitate to be born into a body because I don't believe we are born. As Krishna counseled Arjuna, we are not born, nor do we die. We only identify with the body. But he always emphasized waking up now, waking up now. I heard him say during a gathering at Mount Washington on a special occasion, in the presence of several hundred who were there, mostly resident disciples of Mount Washington and Snitas, he said, there are some here who will be siddhas, and there are many who will be jivan muktas. And he was talking about this present life cycle, this present time phase, not in the future. Many siddhas, many fulfilled, self-realized, liberated souls, and some self-realized souls still yet to work out a residue of karma, but self-realized. Shankara, philosopher seer of India, 8th century, in one of his writings wrote, Brahman is real, all else is unreal. Supreme consciousness is permanent self-existent being, changeless reality. Phenomena is transitory, it appears, it dissolves, it comes and goes. And then, Atman is Brahman and nothing else. The self is pure consciousness and nothing else. And this is the emphasis that Master made to us. That's how I received it anyway. We are now the self. We are now a ray of supreme consciousness, only to be realized, not to be attained, but to awaken to. We are already it. In many traditions and teaching systems, there is this emphasis that it is difficult to attain self-realization and difficult to become self-realized. We don't become in that we attain or acquire. We simply awaken to the realization of that which is already so, and that can happen instantaneously. It may occur in progressive episodes of awakening, or it may occur in an instant. We never know when it's going to happen. It can happen any moment. And then we see everything clearly as it is. And this is self-realization. We are already the self, you know that, in your heart. Many of you perhaps know it from realization experiences, I hope so. But with me, Master always emphasized the importance of God first, awakening in this incarnation. And this has always been my focus, to do the best I can to help myself to wellness and spiritual growth, which is Kriya Yoga. Kriya Yoga is more than just pranayama and Jyoti Mudra and the supplemental techniques which are so useful. Kriya Yoga is more than that. Kriya Yoga is everything we do when we choose a lifestyle which is totally supportive of wellness and spiritual growth. And then we experience episodes of awakening in cosmic consciousness and God consciousness and transcendental states. And we see, as Master used to say so often, the world is like a dream. It is, our perception of it until we awaken is illusory. But then we do awaken, and then for the duration of our involvement with the phenomenal world, we live our lives as servants of God, live selflessly, only doing God's will as that will is revealed to us. And this is my understanding. I'm very happy to share with you. Very much appreciate being with you this weekend. And thank you, Swami, for the opportunity. God bless. I'll see you after the service. Peace.
Fortunately, he accepted me for training and let me stay at the headquarters at the SRF headquarters in Los Angeles. And then after 3 months, he sent me to Phoenix. They had a branch center in Phoenix, Arizona. And I was sent to Phoenix, where I did my spiritual practice But every 2 months, I went from Phoenix back to California at his request to be with him a few days wherever he was at one of the centers. So I had that personal contact with him on those scheduled visits. And I took to the monastic life very, very well. I enjoyed the silence. I enjoyed the discipline. I enjoyed the long hours of meditation. And then in 1951, I was ordained. He ordained me, and I wasn't ready to teach at that time, but he was preparing for the future because he passed in March 1952. So he ordained me in the autumn of 1951, and with the understanding that it would be later that I would be able to teach and to initiate. And he was very spontaneous. Some of you have read his books, I'm sure. He was very spontaneous, I imagine, like your Baba is here. And I remember when he ordained me, there was no pre-planning. You couldn't go and be a monk and then be told that in 2 or 3 years you can be ordained to teach. It was a matter of qualification. If you were ready to be ordained, he saw that you were. He ordained you and authorized you to teach and initiate. If you weren't ready, you could be there for years and it wouldn't happen. But I remember on this occasion, there was no discussion about ordination. And I was visiting Los Angeles with the senior minister from the Phoenix Center. We were there for a few days. And the night before we were to leave and go back to Phoenix, Master came in from an errand. And his car was parked on the lower driveway by the building. And some of the resident disciples gathered around the car, and he talked with us for a few minutes. And then he invited Herbert, who was the senior minister from Phoenix, and myself to go up with him upstairs to the top floor where he had his private quarters. And we went up there, and he sat in a chair in the hallway, and we stood. And he gave Herbert some advice about the Phoenix Center and asked about some of the members there. And then it was almost like an afterthought. He was getting ready to dismiss us, and we could always tell when he was going to conclude a time with us like that, because he'd be quiet. Then he'd say, "All right." And that was goodbye, you know. And he bless us with the spiritual eye, and we would go, you know. So he got to that stage where he was quiet. We knew his "all right" was going to come out any moment. And he said, "Oh." He like that, like a thought just came into his mind. He said, "Oh." And I was standing here, and Herbert was standing in front of him. And he said, "Kneel down." So I knelt by his chair, and he put his hands on my head, and he ordained me. And he said, "Teach as I have taught, heal as I have healed, and initiate devotees of God into Kriya Yoga." And that was it. And when I remember right after that, when he took his hands away, Herbert was standing watching, and Herbert was 2 years my senior. And he said, "Oh, sir, is Roy to initiate into Kriya Yoga?" And Master said, "You too." He said, "The same God who is in me is in you, and what I have done you should do." So that's how he was with us, very spontaneous, you know. But Master was very strong and very, when you were with him you felt safe. There was this, but like with Baba there's this quietness, this centeredness, that strength right there, you know. And Master was like that. Very sweet-natured, very patient, very wise. Yet he could be a strict disciplinarian when he had to. He didn't like to discipline people. He told us that when he met Sri Yukteswar when he was out of high school, that I was talking to Clifford on the way down today. He told us that when he met Sri Yukteswar that for the first 2 or 3 years it was very challenging for him, because Yogananda's nature when he was a boy, he was impulsive, devotional and impulsive. And Yukteswar was tough. He was loving
and fair, but he was tough. There's one way to do it, and that's my way. And so Yogananda told us it was very difficult the first 2 or 3 years to relate to that type of discipline. But he admitted that he needed that to balance his personality and prepare him for his mission to the West. So Yogananda was like that. He was kinder and more patient outwardly. But when he had to be a disciplinarian, he could be. And then he would usually soften it a little bit. He would say, "I only do this because I want you to be as strong as I am." But so it was a marvelous experience for me at that time. And when I went over to visit him on those occasions, those regular occasions, I never went with any sense of need or with a lot of questions to be answered. I just wanted to be in his presence. But invariably, he would say something or do something that would meet every need that I had, you know. And I remember the first thing he said to me when we had our first private talk, when I first met him, just before he dismissed me, his advice for living there and entered into the program. He said, read a little and meditate more and think of God all the time. And then almost 2 years and 2 months after that, just before he passed, I visited him over to the desert retreat at 29 Palms. He had a small house out at 29 Palms. And I was visiting him there just a few weeks before he passed. He was in vibrant health. He looked good. And we talked for a while. He had me in the living room. We had always sat close. And we talked for a while, and I let him do the talking. As I say, I didn't go with a lot of questions. He would talk about God and the saints and tell anecdotes about the gurus and so forth. And then his parting advice on that occasion, just before he blessed me and sent me out, was he got quiet. Then he said, don't bother yourself with what others do or don't do. And he said, don't look back. He said, look straight ahead and go all the way in this incarnation. And I knew what he meant by that because I heard him talk before, you know, liberation, God realization. And then he said, and you can. That was his last advice. First was read a little, meditate more, think of God all the time. The last advice from his lips was look straight ahead, go all the way, and you can. This is how he was, you know. He was always reminding us, emphasizing what was important. There was a gentle, soft side to him, but he always got down to, you never left his presence without being reminded of why you were here on the planet, you know, what the purpose of life is, the ultimate purpose.
So, it is really a beautiful moment and a divine opportunity that on this special day, when we are celebrating Gurudev's birth centenary and combined with the Punyatithi Mahasamadhi day of Gurudev, and it is really a blessings of God and lineage of our masters to be in the presence of our beloved and adorable Roy Eugene Davis Baba. In spite of his busy schedule and his own dedicated service for the cause of Kriya Yoga. So he's here. When I was young, I saw few disciples of Sri Yukteswarji. When I looked at them, I was feeling so much of love for Sri Yukteswarji through them. A tree is known by the fruit. Similarly, coming to this country, because to find so many direct disciples of Paramahansa Yogananda in India is not so easy, as he spent most of his active part of life as predestined or as a divine mission here in this country mostly. Similarly, when I met or saw or I was in the company of some direct disciples of Paramahansa Yogananda, I always feel that he's reflected through his beautiful disciples. Ramakrishna Paramahansa said, from soft clay you can make many earthenwares. If it is not soft, it is not possible to make good utensils, pots. From young age, when one's mind is drawn towards divinity or spirituality, it is a rare opportunity. That happened in the life of Roy Eugene Baba. Troubles and difficulties opened the eyes, and whatever challenges he had to meet in his teenage brought him closer to God and bringing at the feet of Paramahamsa Yogananda. I'll not take too much of time. I'll request Baba to speak.
Just for a few minutes. All right.
If they have some, you can speak little, and if they have any questions,
Yes,
they
we
can
can do
ask.
that.
Okay.
Good morning, one and all. It's a pleasure to once again be here at the ashram. And as Clifford and his wife and I were driving in, I noticed changes that have occurred here on the grounds in the last few years. So everything looks very nice. As was mentioned by Swamiji, I had the good fortune to meet Paramahansa Yogananda when I was 18 years of age. I had read 2 books on Hatha Yoga during my high school years, but when I read Autobiography of a Yogi and saw the photographs of Laramashai, Sri Yukteswar and Master, and the artist's portrait of Mahavatar Babaji, I felt an instant connection. I enjoyed reading about the other saints and seeing the photographs of other saints, but those portrayals of our Guru lineage were the ones that attracted me. And I knew then that the Kriya Yoga was my path. And so after high school, I grew up in Ohio on a farm. And after high school, I went to Los Angeles, California, and I met Master 2 days before Christmas. In 1949, I hitchhiked from Florida. In fact, I had come down from Ohio with the misguided idea that I should come down to Florida and work and make some money and then go to California. But not being successful at making money in Florida, after several weeks, I hitchhiked from Florida to California, which I don't recommend anyone do now. But it was as though there was a hand guiding me every step of the way. And I arrived in Los Angeles at the SRF headquarters about 6 in the evening. And
after 7 days on the road, it was a timely arrival because dinner was being served in the men's kitchen, and I was invited to join them. And then one of the monks took me up to the ground floor level to talk with me, to ask the usual questions. Why are you here? And how did you hear about self-realization, fellowship, and so on? And as we were talking, Master came into the room on the way out to his car. And he shook my hand, and I would like to be able to say that he said, I have been looking for you, waiting for you. But he didn't. And he shook my hand, and he asked, how old are you? And I said, I'm 18, sir. And he said, well, then, do your parents know you're here? And I said, it's all right. So he said, all right. And he put his hand on my forehead for a moment, and he said, I'll see you again. And went out to his car. So that was my beginning with him. And I was with him for a little over 2 years, because he passed in March of 1952. And I was at the Self-Realization Fellowship headquarters for about 2 months, fitting into the daily schedule with the other male monastics, having the opportunity to see Master a few times a week. So when he came out on the grounds or coming and going to his car, he would stop and talk with us. And then he sent me to Phoenix, Arizona, to assist with a organizational project there. And there was only one other monk there. It's the minister in charge of the branch center in Phoenix. And that was one of the greatest blessings that he sent me there. Because while participation with the group of monks was all right, and it was the first 2 months was an opportunity to get into a routine of meditation and work. I found that in Phoenix that I had privacy, and the monk who was there was a good role model, and he assigned me my work assignments, and then except for once a week when we would talk about what needed to be done on the grounds or in the building. He had his duties, I had mine. And so I could live completely secluded and focused on my purpose for being there. And so I arranged my own schedule of meditation. I would meditate every morning from about 3 to about 6:30 or 7. And then about 30 minutes at noon, I would practice mantra. And in the evening, from about 7 to 9, or to 9, sometimes 10, I would meditate again. And I would use the various techniques that I had learned from Master, the mantra and Om contemplation, Kriya Pranayama. And I had not yet been initiated into Kriya Pranayama. But I soon found that shortly after I arrived, that Master expected everyone who lived there to know and practice the Kriya procedures, and so he would, sometimes he would have one of the senior monastics teach the new arrivals, and then later formally initiate the disciple. Or also, in just being with the other fellows and also listening to Master talk during informal gatherings about meditation practices, you could easily pick up the processes without being formally initiated. But it was a great blessing that he sent me over to Arizona because I had that private time, seclusion. And but when he sent me, he said, come back to see me every 60 days. So every 60 days I returned to California to have several days private time with him. And it was usually out at his desert retreat in 29 Palms, where he had a small house. And he had gone there during the last 3 or 4 years of his earth life to be in seclusion, to finish his writing commentary on the Bhagavad Gita and other scriptures, and to give the people to whom he had assigned the responsibility of carrying on the work, giving them the opportunity to make decisions without him being too readily available. And so I had private time with him there. Then I would go back to Phoenix. And I was initiated in August of 1950. And the occasion was a group gathering of resident disciples and some members of the organization in the Los Angeles area who gathered at the headquarters. And Master conducted the initiation, and then afterwards everyone that came by in a line, and he touched them on the spiritual eye. And I remember when he did it, he said, at one time while he was doing this, he said, "I am sending light into your body. I'm giving you everything, and you have to be ready to receive it." And then after the Kriya service, when most of the folks had gone, I stayed behind with some of the monks, and we were putting the wooden folding chairs away, because we had brought extra chairs into the chapel for the occasion. And Master was still sitting there up front, in front of the altar, and comfortable. He was happy. It had been a wonderful event, a wonderful occasion. And I was close to him, about this close, collecting a chair, and I caught his eye. He looked at me, and I caught his eye, and he could see that I wanted to say something, so he motioned for me to come. And I went over to him, and I said, "Will you show me the spiritual light? Will you show me the inner light?" Because during the course of his preliminary talk, before giving instruction in meditation practice, he mentioned that he was so happy to have so many people gathered on that occasion. And he compared it to his early days in Boston in the early 1920s, when perhaps he would have 25 or 30 at a class. And he said during that time, he said, I had more time to work individually with each person and show them the inner light. And I heard him say that. So after everyone had gone, and I asked him if he would show me the inner light. And so he said he didn't, there was no discussion. He simply said, "Well, kneel down." And that was so he could put his hands in my forehead. And he said, look into the spiritual eye. And I looked, and I saw immediately two lights. They were like half moons, brilliant against a dark background. And they started to come together. And when they almost merged, someone off to one side made a noise with the chair that he was folding, and it distracted my attention, and the light dispersed. And the moment that happened, and there was no conversation going between us, so I didn't tell him what I was seeing. And when that happened, he took his hands down, and he said, "Let's wait a moment and do it again." And this time, when the lights almost came together, he said, "Now look into the distance." And so I steadied my gaze, and I saw this brilliant ball of light. And then he took his hands down, and he said, "What you saw was Krishna and Radha, spirit and nature. And whenever you look like that, meaning look in that manner, you can see that light." And of course, I found when I was meditating on my own, it was not always easy to look like that, to see the light quite so easily. But I remember his touch was able to do that. He could do that with others too, who were receptive. Just his touch and his intention. And he could look in here in his own spiritual eye, and he could see what the devotee was seeing. That's how he could guide them and direct them. And it was only less than 2 months after I was with him that I began to experience occasions of spontaneous arousal of energies in the spine. And especially when I meditated, but sometimes during the day, it would just happen spontaneously. And Master never discussed this, and he never talked about it publicly. I never heard him talk about Shaktipat. But I noticed that with me and with others in whom this life force was becoming active, that when he was with us in informal gatherings, he would watch us very carefully. He would look at us very intently and keep an eye on us. And now and then he would smile, and he would say, "You're doing well. I'm very pleased." But there was never any discussion about it, but he kept track of us that way. So I was fortunate to have those early experiences with him like that. And then, of course, in in March of '52, he passed. He was at a banquet that was arranged in honor of Ambassador Sen, India's ambassador at that time to America, and who was in Los Angeles. Master had hosted him, prepared a dinner for him and his wife and his entourage at SRF headquarters 2 or 3 evenings before the banquet. But the Indian Society of Southern California had arranged a public event at the Ambassador Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, and they invited Master to be one of the people to sit at the head table. And so he went, and he talked. About 9:30 that evening, when dinner was over and people were giving little short talks. And he gave a very short talk, and then he quoted a few lines from one of his poems, Mother India. And with the final words, "I am hallowed, my body touched that sacred sod," he lifted his eyes and slumped to the floor and was gone. And so the minister, who was the senior minister at the Phoenix Church, with whom I worked, was at the banquet and on that Friday night. And he called me at the Phoenix Center. It was 10:30, phone call came in. And he told me what had happened. And he said to me, he said, "I've talked with Faye Wright." Faye Wright is now Sister Dayamata, president of SRF. "Talk with Faye, and you are to call the members in Phoenix and have them gather on Sunday night and perform a memorial service for Master, and then come over here for the funeral service." So I did, and so I performed the first memorial service for Master. And it was at the Phoenix SRF Center, a very small group of members gathered. Then I went over to Los Angeles, and I went upstairs to his room where his body was on the bed, lying in state. And devotees were coming and going. And there was a sadness and a sense of loss you could feel among many of the devotees and disciples. And I felt that too, but it wasn't overwhelming, and because Master had taught me better than that. We loved the Guru's physical presence and form, and but we know that the Guru is, as Master used to say of himself, "I am not the Guru, God is the Guru, and I am only God's servant." And so his body was there, but there was no diminishment of attunement with his spirit and with the consciousness of the Guru line and the energy of the Guru line. It was there. And so I was aware of that. But so after the funeral service, the day after the funeral service, Sister Dayamata, who was then the executive secretary for the organization, called me into her office and told me that it was Master's wish that I be the minister at the Phoenix Center, and they were recalling the minister who was there back to California. Master had ordained me in the autumn of 1951, and it was a spontaneous moment. I was visiting there on one of my regular 60-day interval visits, but this time it happened to be at the SRF headquarters. I think it was right after Thanksgiving. And the night before I was to go back to Phoenix, he asked me and one of the other monks to go upstairs with him to the top level of the building. And he sat in a chair in the hallway and talked to the other monk for a while about certain matters. And then he turned to me. I was standing just to his left side. And he said, "Kneel down." And I knelt, and he put his hands on my head. And he said, "I ordain you a minister of self-realization. Heal as I have healed, teach as I have taught, heal as I have healed, and initiate devotees of God into Kriya Yoga." And the monk who was observing this was surprised at his words and said, "Sir, is Roy to initiate people?" And Master said, "You too. The same God who is in me is in you. And what I have done, you should do." Of course, I wasn't ready to initiate at that time. Master was preparing me for the future. I had some learning and growing to do. I was only 20 years old at the time. I'd only been there 2 years. So, but it was an understanding without having to be verbalized that this was consent, but then it would be later before I would be able to do that. So that's how it happened. It's just spontaneous, and that transmission of authority to represent the Guru line. And so I have been doing this ever since, and now these many years, 56 years, going on 56 years, and I've never deviated from the path. And many who have known me over the years know that I've always been consistent in presenting the Kriya Yoga teachings in a straight, practical, honest way. Because, as you know, as initiates and devotees on this path, this way is very practical. When I first read about the philosophical principles of yoga when I was about 16 or 17, I thought, this is true. Because I was not asked to believe anything, but the offering was, here are the facts of life. If you think like this and do these things, you're going to have these results. You can experiment and find out whether or not these teachings are true. So that appealed to me very much. And I have a devotional nature, but I'm also discerning and thankfully intuitive. But so this path it's real. If we do what we are supposed to do and discipline our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors and see through the illusional sense of self called the ego, then very quickly we can be awake to the truth of what we are as units of pure consciousness. I remember, I mentioned earlier, it was a blessing for me, I feel, that Master sent me to Phoenix to be alone in my spiritual practice, except for contact with him. Because I remember occasionally I would visit the headquarters and sometimes hear the other monks talking, and they were nice fellows. But they would spend, some of them, not all, but some would spend their time in useless talk. "Oh, do you think it's possible to be enlightened in this incarnation?" "Oh, I don't know. I have a lot of karma. Maybe it'll take several incarnations." And so on and on. The most I can hope for is that next time I'll come back early in life and get a better start early, and then maybe I can do it. And I didn't want to hear that talk at all. And because when I first read about the ideal of liberation of consciousness, spiritual enlightenment and liberation of consciousness, when I was a teenager, my impulse was, I can be like that. I want to be like that. I can be like that. And so I never wanted to hear, even in the early years, any talk to the contrary. And of course, Master occasionally reminded disciples, don't poison each other's minds with funny ideas and nonsense, But sometimes people will talk. So I've always been focused. Sri Yukteswar, Paramahansa Yogananda's guru and guru of Paramahamsa Hariharananda, Sri Yukteswar used to tell his disciples, the boat that carries devotees across the river of delusion to the far shore of freedom in God, is ready to depart. Who will go? Who will go? If no one goes, I will go. And he would say, be like that. And Sri Yukteswar, I'm sure you have heard stories from your master. Sri Yukteswar was a disciplinarian. And Yogananda told us, the disciples one time, he said, it was very difficult, he said, for me, Yogananda, he said, the first 2 years of Sri Yukteswar because he was so strict. Because you know from reading Yogananda's book, Autobiography of a Yogi, when Master was very young, he was impulsive and devotional. But Yukteswar was strict. But Master said, I needed that training to balance my personality. And he said he couldn't get rid of me. But Yukteswar was very, very, very strict. Sometimes Master said he would go rest early in the evening and then meditate maybe 10, 11 o'clock at night until dawn. And now and then he would make the rounds of the ashram and look into the private rooms of the disciples, male disciples, to see if they were meditating. And if they weren't, sometimes he would go in and tug on their ear and say, wake up, do you want to sleep your life away? So he was setting the example. But there's something that is not understood by people who are not initiated or not perceptive, don't have insight into the yogic procedures, is that there is a power that flows through the Guru lineage. And whenever I would visit Master in California, he would almost always tell me, before I left to go back to Phoenix, he would almost always say, stay in tune with me, because when you are in tune with me, I can help you. And when you're not in tune, then it is difficult. It's like having static in the mental radio. So stay in tune with me. And I found that when I was in Phoenix, 300 and 400 miles away from Los Angeles, that when I thought of him and the Gurus with love and respect, I had the same feeling that I had when I was with him. It was like they were there. There was a presence. I could feel the presence and the support. And Master, in the early years, 2 years, he never asked me about my meditation practice routine. Now and then when I visited him, he would say, how do you do Jyoti Mudra? Or how do you do Kriya Pranayama? And then he would give me some pointers. He would say, that's good, or else he would say, do it this way. But he never asked specifically, how long do you meditate, and in what sequence do you practice the techniques? He never asked. But he didn't have to. I found out, because he could know, just by thinking of us. He said, I go through your souls every day. He used to say that to the disciples sometimes, I go through your souls every day. And then now and then I would visit him, and when I would, of course I always made sure I was in good shape when I went. And when I would go, sometimes when I would first arrive, he would turn to Dayamata or one of the others, and he would say, well, look how well Roy is doing. Then he would say, whatever you're doing, keep it up. But he never asked specifically, what are you doing? But he knew I was self-motivated. I mean, from the core of my being, not ego-directed, but self-motivated. I've never needed anyone to tell me you can do it, or to cheer me up, or to cheer me on. I've never needed that. I've always been strongly self-motivated, and had the ability to make right choices and to be determined. So, but there is that power that flows through the Guru lineage. And of course it is transmitted, it can be transmitted at the time of initiation too. But that makes the difference between just having a teacher who provides information and on the other hand being connected spiritually, mentally and spiritually with a lineage of Gurus through whom this power flows. Of course it comes from the source, and the Guru, any Guru will say that they are only a conduit. The word channel is not a good word today in some circles, within the way he's channeling and so forth. But a conduit, an instrument through which the power flows. And it is personal when in contact with the teacher, but it is impersonal also. It is impersonal. It is just there. And it's accessible to everyone. And Master used to constantly remind the disciples, you have to make yourself receptive to it. If you can be receptive to it, you can have it. And so that's the part we have to, that's our part, to make ourselves receptive to it. And then when it begins to express through us, and then in our spiritual awakening and our progress on the path is spontaneous. In the Kriya tradition, according to Patanjali Yoga Sutra, when the restrictions are removed, then the light of the soul is self-revealed. The innate qualities and capacities are unveiled and naturally unfold. So it's not that we have to work hard to become something, it is what mainly we are getting rid of the stuff that gets in the way of spontaneous spiritual awakening and the unfoldment of our innate capacities and qualities. We have the potential. According to Patanjali and the great masters, we have the potential to express excellence and to use extraordinary powers of perception and exceptional abilities, functional abilities. But so our capacities are virtually unlimited, But as I mentioned last night at the group gathering in Fort Lauderdale, I think that it is important that we always keep before us in our inner mind, inner vision, what our ultimate aim in life is. While we are here, we have duties to perform, we have things to do, lessons to learn, of course, but a service to render. But the ultimate aim is to be fully awake, to be liberated. And I think anyone who aspires to be fully awake and who can surrender what needs to be surrendered or let go, to allow the innate inclination, to have their awareness completely restored to wholeness, can be liberated in the present incarnation. Not to wait until drawing the last breath. I received an email from someone several months ago who asked, how can I be assured that I will be liberated when I leave this world? And the only answer I could provide then, and even now, was the only way you can be assured that you're going to be liberated when you leave this world is to be liberated before you leave it. So that makes sense, doesn't it? Get the job done. And not, rather than, oh, I hope I make it. I hope when I go I'll see the light and the masters will be there. No, my thought is we want to be fully awake long before then. Then the question comes, what will I do then? I won't have anything more to do. Oh yes, you have work to do. After you are liberated, you can continue to serve. You can help others wake up. That's useful. The Master used to say, while you are learning to swim, you can help others to swim. But also when you are liberated, then you have nothing more to do on your own behalf, but then you are completely free to assist others who are capable of being helped. You are free to help others be awake. And that is a great blessing opportunity to be able to do that, to show others the way to their spiritual awakening, their liberation of consciousness. So, I thank you for the opportunity of being here with you, and I enjoy being with you. We are all spiritual family in the same Kriya tradition, and I think it's good that we acknowledge that, and we have the opportunity to share from time to time on a personal level in this manner. Thanks so much. If there are any questions or inquiries, yes.
Could you share, if you may, your experience of our Divine Buddha Baba release?
Pardon?
Could you share a little bit of your meeting with our divine Gurudev Baba?
With
Hariharananda?
yes, in 2002, I had been aware of Baba's activities for several years, but I had never met him. And in 2002, I was scheduled to present a meditation seminar in Fort Lauderdale at a hotel function room. And the thought came to my mind. I'd heard that Baba was here in residence. So I contacted someone here at the ashram and asked if I could visit him, and that permission was given. And so I came down 2 days early before my scheduled event. And Clifford, where did Clifford go? He's outside. Clifford drove me down, and Baba was in his bedroom and lying down resting. He wasn't under the covers, he had his robe, but he was just resting. And he was very quiet, and so I said, we just talked only a few minutes, and just pleasant talk, you know. And then he just reclined there with his eyes open in a very peaceful state, and then I held his hand for a while. And those who were there, were any of you here at the time? Those who were there were sitting on the floor around the foot of the bed. And then after a while I took my leave, and that was our short visit. It was very peaceful, very calm, and so I was glad to have come and to have visited him. You know, Paramahansa Yogananda is my spiritual father, and Paramahansa Hariharananda is the brother of Yogananda, so that makes him my spiritual uncle. So it was nice. It was nice to see him then, and of course several months later he passed. So I'm very glad it happened that way. I was able to see him and to pay my respects and to make that contact. Yes?
Can you please describe the experience you had when you observed Paramahansa Hariharananda in Mahasamadhi?
What is this?
When Paramahansa Hariharananda went to Mahasamadhi state, I wanted to get your experience, what you felt.
When Swami Yogananda experienced Mahasamadhi,
Not in the final Mahasamadhi, I'm talking about when
I don't, what did he say?
In Samadhi state. Okay, he's telling your experience if you have when you saw Yogananda in deep meditation or in Samadhi.
When I saw Yogananda in Samadhi, of course, we would gather with him to meditate on special occasions, Christmas, Thanksgiving, his birthday. The monks and the sisters of the order, the renunciate disciples, would gather and meditate with him. And when he meditated, he was so deeply absorbed that if you opened your eyes and looked at him, you saw that he was completely absorbed. He was not body conscious. But my perception of him was that he was always in a superconscious state, even when he was not meditating. And so that was a sahaja samadhi, a spontaneous oneness consciousness all the time. Even he didn't have to be immobilized and physically still with breath stopped and so forth to be established in samadhi. But I never saw him when he wasn't in a God-conscious state, even when he was interacting and so on. He once told a small group of us, just not in a quiet way, he said, I banished Yogananda long ago. Only God dwells here now. That was in his last years, when he was more absolute. I remember one monk telling the story that a year or two before Master passed, he was asking metaphysical, philosophical questions. And Master said, don't bother me with such questions now. These days I am more absolute. and not inclined to discuss such matters. So he was already withdrawing and pulling away. And so the last 2 years when I was with him, I noticed that he was always appropriate, and when talking with you, good communication and very attentive, very caring, very supportive, but there was that aura of aloofness about him too, of otherworldliness, like he was in two worlds simultaneously. And perhaps your Baba was like that in the later years. But there was a transcendental quality about it, a characteristic about him. That's why I mentioned last night that when I went to see him, I went to be in his presence for darshan. I went to be in his presence, to experience his consciousness, rather than to go and ask a lot of philosophical questions. I could get those answers out of books, you know. And I didn't have any personal problems. So I went just to be with him. And I watched him very carefully. And endeavored to be in tune with him. He used to say in private conversations with small groups of monks, he would say, when I'm here with you like this, he said, tune in, connect your spiritual eye with mine, and get behind my spoken words, and you can understand, then you can know what is behind the words. And occasionally he said, it pleases me when you understand what I say. It pleases me even more when you understand without my having to say it. So, my observation, my experience with him was that there was the outer relationship, the outer communication, but there was a silent transmission that occurred. And now and then he would be talking with informally with a group of fellows, and he would be talking about it on a certain philosophical theme or explaining a certain method of meditation practice and so on. And even before he finished his explanation, I picked up on what he was driving at, what the conclusion was going to be. And when I did that, he would glance over and smile and keep on talking to the others. I noticed he did that with others too. He could tell when they got it. And he was aware of that. So there is that silent transmission that is there. It is very strengthening. So, but since his passing, outside of a few dreams I've had of him through the years, several dreams, symbolic dreams perhaps, or come out of the subconscious, I've had no direct communication from him. But because of my attunement with that state of consciousness that he represents, and the Guru line, it's always strengthening and enlivening when I'm at that place where I'm aware of that transmission of force that flows through the Guru line. But I'm fully aware that each one of us has to be fully spiritually awake. We can't lean on the Gurus. We can't expect them to do for us what we can do for ourselves. Master used to say to us, I want you to be as strong as I am. I want you to be like me. Not a copy, you know, of him. But he said, I want you to be as strong as I am. That's the Guru's function. The Guru's function is to bring out completely the innate potential of the disciple. The Gurus don't want people to be following around and worshiping them and leaning on them and being dependent on them. They don't want them to be arrogant and self-righteous either. They want them to be egoists, you know. But still, they want them. Their function is to wake them up, is to help them to realize their own divinity, to become self and God realized. Otherwise, their mission is not successful. That is their function. So the guru is the one who removes darkness and ignorance and confusion. But the disciple, of course, has the responsibility to participate in the process and do what can be done to be receptive to that awakening and learning experience. Yes, take one more, then we can. All right. Thank you so much. I enjoyed being with you. Wish you well. I'm glad, and especially glad to be with you on this special occasion of celebration in honor of your Guru. And we have beautiful weather, so it's a beautiful weekend. And thank you, Swami. What led me to Paramahansa Yogananda was that I had read in high school 2 books on yoga philosophy, and I was impressed with what I read and with the practices that I tried to experiment with. And then when I was 18, I read his book, Autobiography of a Yogi, like many millions of people have now. And as soon as I read the book, I was convinced that this was my contact and that he was my guru or would be my guru. And so I resolved at that time, when I got out of high school, to go to California. So the autumn of 1949, I did just that. And I arrived there right around Christmas times, December 23rd, 1949. I was very fortunate to be able to meet him within an hour of my arrival. No one knew that I was coming. I hadn't sent a note ahead to let anyone know because I was hitchhiking across the country. But I arrived about 6 o'clock in the evening, and one of the senior monks invited me to have supper with the young fellows who were there in training. And after that meeting, after the supper time, Donald Walters, who was the senior monk at the time, invited me up to the main floor of the building of the SRF headquarters. And while we were talking, Paramahansa Yogananda and Fay Wright and her sister Virginia came through the room on the way out to the car. And Yogananda stopped for a moment and shook my hand. I would like to be able to say that he said, "I've been waiting for you," but he didn't. He shook my hand and he asked, "How old are you?" And I told him I was 18. His next question was, "Do your parents know you're here?" And I told him it was all right. And he said, "All right." And he still had an accent. He said, "All right. And I'll see you again," and went out to the car. So that was my first contact with him. The next day, I participated in a 6-hour meditation with the resident disciples and a few guests who had been invited. And then on Sunday morning, the 25th, I went to the Hollywood SRF temple to hear him lecture. And then that afternoon, I had a private talk with him. And I asked him then if I could be his disciple. And he said, yes, I could stay. And we only were together about 20 minutes, but it was sufficient. I remember on that occasion, after he gave me instruction on how to fit into the routine with the other fellows, and how often to meditate and what books to read. And his concluding words were, read a little, meditate more, and think of God all the time. So that was my immediate connection with him. My first impression was that I had known him before, or that it was a destined occasion, because there was simply quick rapport, instant rapport, and a feeling of security and trust in him. And so I didn't have to go through the process of getting acquainted with him, to know him, there was an instant attunement with him, with his mind and his consciousness. And one of the most obvious characteristics, and many people have commented on this over the years who had met him, was his kindness. He was very attentive when he was interacting with people, very alert. He was a good listener, but he was very kind, non-judgmental. And everyone came away with the feeling that, well, he's a very nice man. Even if they didn't know he was a spiritual teacher, if he was dressed in ordinary clothes and didn't have his robe on, and he was not in the role of teacher, if they met him in a social situation, they almost invariably they came away impressed about how nice he was, how courteous and kind. Whenever I was with him, I felt a sense of omnipresence and great power, but not a personal, egocentric power, but a cosmic power that was just sort of embodied in his body, and he just carried that consciousness of wholeness and oneness. And when you were with him, you could feel that. He was very attentive to his disciples, and he, of course, communicated with each one according to their temperament and however best to communicate with them. He was very encouraging, very supportive, very encouraging. He always reminded us to pay attention to our daily routine of study and meditation, mostly meditation, and to do our work with an attitude of rendering service without attachment to the results. And so, of course, there in that environment, we were serving what he called his work or his mission at the Self-Realization Fellowship. So it was a privilege, really, to participate in that work that he represented. My personal experiences with him were very intimate and very, very helpful. I remember a few weeks after I had arrived, I saw him one evening in the lower hallway of the headquarters building, and we talked for just a moment or two, and he went into the elevator to go upstairs, and the door closed, and then the door opened again, and he put his head out, and I was still standing there. And he said, "You have a wonderful future, Roy." And that's how he worked with me. He always told me that I had a good future and that I should be patient and follow the procedures that he outlined for my spiritual practices. And then, of course, he did a marvelous thing for me. And this ties in with how he related to disciples. Within a few weeks after I arrived, he sent me over to Phoenix, Arizona. There was one minister over there, a young man, 2 years my senior, who was needed some assistance there with the work that he was doing. And Master sent me over there and told me to come back to see him every 2 months. And that was a marvelous thing that he did, because my temperament is I tend to be introverted, and I have never needed the support of a group around me for encouragement or feeling of security. So over there, I was all alone except for this one brother disciple who was a good role model, and for the most part very quiet, and we only talked once a week to instruct me on what needed to be done. And then every two months I would go back to California, and that gave me an opportunity to be with Yogananda privately for 2 or 3 hours each time I visited him. And sometimes an hour one day, an hour another day, 30 minutes this day, 2 hours the next day. And usually we just sat and talked, and I let him do the talking. I learned that was the most useful thing to do. And now and then we would walk around the perimeter of his retreat facility out at 29 Palms, California. And I never went over with any pressing questions or any needs. I always made sure that when I went, I had been in a positive mood and been meditating because I wanted him to see that I was doing well with my spiritual practices. But on one occasion, we were walking around the property, and he talked for a while about God and the spiritual path and told me some stories about his experiences with his guru, Sri Yukteswar. And then after a while, there was a quiet pause, and then he asked, "Do you have any questions?" And one came into my mind. I had, a few weeks earlier, been perusing his book, Autobiography of a Yogi. And of course, in that book, he had written about many saints that he met when he was a young boy in India, back in the early part of the 1900s. And the thought had come to my mind, I wonder how many of these saintly people by now are spiritually liberated, meaning fully enlightened, and without any delusions or illusions, fully self-realized. So I asked that question, and his answer was very, very direct and nonchalant. He said, "Oh, not many." He said, "Many saints are satisfied to experience the bliss of God communion, and they don't aspire to go beyond that stage." Then after a pause, he said, "But you must go all the way," and that's how he encouraged me. He was always reminding me of what he called the goal, the aim of life, which is to be fully spiritually awake. And he always said, "You can do it." But that was his emphasis with me. When I was with him, we never talked about comparative religions or theology. It was always about the importance of being focused on the spiritual path with the aim of being spiritually enlightened. One of Master's most spiritually advanced disciples was a businessman who lived in Kansas City, Missouri, Mr. James Lynn. He had been born in Louisiana. His father was a sharecropper. He left home in his middle teens, went to Kansas City, finished his education there, his high school education, and then studied accounting and went to law school. And by the time he was 21, he was admitted to the bar as a lawyer, and also he was a certified public accountant. And he then had a job with an insurance company, a small insurance company that specialized in selling policies to wholesale lumber dealers. And then after a very few years, the owner had to retire for reasons of health, and a business associate of Mr. Lynn's, who was a vice president of a bank in Kansas City, loaned him the money to buy the business. And he paid the business off in 3 years from the profits that were generated. And so by age 30, he had already made his first million. But as he said later to some disciples with whom he talked, he said, "I was successful in a material way, but I was not satisfied. I was very restless, and something was missing in my life." And so in 1931, Paramahansa Yogananda lectured in Kansas City, and Mr. Lynn was invited by his wife to go to hear the Yogananda at the public lectures. And the first night, he said, he sat in the back of the auditorium, and suddenly he realized for the first time in a long time he wasn't restless. He was very calm. And then shortly after that, he met Master personally. And for the remainder of the time that Master was in Kansas City, every morning on the way to work, Mr. Lane would leave early from home, drop by Master's hotel, and spend time with him in his hotel room. And there he learned the basic practices of Kriya Yoga. He learned to meditate. He was initiated into meditation practices. And the first time he practiced Kriya Pranayama in Yogananda's presence when he was initiated, he experienced a state of ecstasy. And then he kept on with his practices, maintained his business interests. In fact, his businesses expanded. He founded another insurance company, for wholesale auto dealers. Finally, later on, branched out into oil drilling in Louisiana and Texas. But he always maintained his daily meditation practice, and he became very, very accomplished as a meditator. And within 6 years, Yogananda told me that he was able to experience transcendent samadhi or superconsciousness. And then, of course, he was very generous through the years with financial support for the organization. And shortly before he passed in 1955, 3 years after Yogananda passed. Shortly before he passed, he transferred $1 million to SRF and stock that he owned. And then, when he passed in 1955, he left another $3 million to the organization. So he was very supportive of the work, naturally, but he was a highly skilled meditator. And Master told me one time, he said, he called him Saint Lin. He said, Saint Lin is the perfect example of Western practicality and Eastern spirituality. So he was, and I knew Mr. Lin, and not socially, but I had a chance to meditate with him a few times and to receive his blessing. So he was a very saintly person. I remember there were 2 Indian gentlemen who visited the Master in 1951 at Civilization Fellowship headquarters, and they met Mr. Lin, and they interacted and talked together and meditated together. And then when Mr. Lin was getting ready to depart and go down to Southern California, he was down by his car, getting ready to get in his car and drive to his destination. And the 2 Indian gentlemen were there, and they said goodbye to him, and they both knelt down and touched his feet, which in India is a traditional way to show respect to a holy man or to someone you respect. And then he turned to one of the male disciples. One of the Indian men turned to one of the male disciples and said, even in India, I have not seen one like him. So he was a very, very exceptional person. Master always said that his work was done in quantity and quality. In the early 20s and 30s, when he came to this country, at first in 1920, but then in the 20s and 30s, he lectured before large audiences, and he called that his quantity work, reaching as many people as possible with a helpful message and information about how they could improve their lives and nurture their spiritual growth. But he was also always on the lookout for those special people who were very receptive to what he had to offer, and he called that the quality work. And of course, the numbers of quality disciples or students were few compared to the many that were served in this wider way. But he liked to reach out to everyone, but he was always looking for those few special people like Mr. Lin and Fay Wright and a few others who really connected with him and stayed with him for years and derived great benefit from their relationship with him. The personal relationship between Master and St. Lin was, of course, very respectful. Master told me that whenever Mr. Lin visited California for his private retreats, he said, we only talk about God. We don't talk about business. He knew that Mr. Lin had his business activities and responsibilities, and when Mr. Lin was in California, he wanted him to be able to withdraw from that temporarily and devote himself entirely to his inner life. So they had a very intimate spiritual relationship and a very confidential relationship. Yogananda had a good sense of humor. It was quiet humor. I never saw him frivolous, but he would sometimes tell humorous stories and laugh along with us, little anecdotes. But if we were with him informally, just as several of us would meet him occasionally in the lower hallway of the main building when he was on his way to his car or coming back from a trip, he would stop and talk with us, and he would tell us sometimes little humorous stories, but he never left us in a light, frivolous mood. He always ended our time together with a provocative thought or a positive idea for us to contemplate, to think about. And we always knew when it was time to conclude the get together and let him go his way and for us to get back to work, because he would pause and then he would say, "All right." That meant goodbye. One evening I was walking out on the grounds at SRF headquarters. It was dark, and I looked up the winding driveway to the headquarters building, and I saw someone walking in my direction in the dim light, and I didn't know who it was. So I just stood there at the foot of the driveway, and I waited. And as the person approached, I recognized it was Master, who was out for an evening walk. And he asked, "Who's that?" Identified myself, and he stopped. And just then another male disciple, came along and stopped. And Master talked with us just 2 or 3 minutes. And then we thought he was going to say, "All right," and move on. But he took off his hat and gave it to me, and he handed his cane, his walking stick, to the other fellow, and then he just went like this 2 or 3 times, tense and relaxed, and that was one of his energization exercise routines. Just did it 2 or 3 times like that. Took his hat and his walking stick back, and he said, "See? No matter how busy I am, I always do my exercises." Then he said, "All right, good night, boys." Faye and Virginia Wright met him also in the early 30s. Faye was 17 at the time, just finishing high school. She had thought of joining a convent, although she was raised as a Mormon. And her mother and brother went to hear Yogananda's public lectures in Salt Lake City, invited her to come and with them. And when she saw him on the stage, she was instantly attracted to him. And she had some facial condition of, I don't know what the cause was, more than acne, but she had some sores on her face, and which made her more shy than she ordinarily would have been. And one night at one of these public lectures with hundreds of people in the auditorium, Master invited her up on the stage, and he asked her about her condition of her face and how long she had that condition had bothered her. And she said she had been quite some time. She had been the dermatologist. They hadn't been able to find a solution. And then he asked her, he said, "Do you believe you can be healed?" She said, "Yes, I do." And he held her hand. And he said, "By the power of God in me, I say that in 7 days you will be healed." And 7 days later, her face was clear, and the condition never returned. Shortly after that, she asked for permission to move to Los Angeles headquarters, and be a resident disciple. And Master said, "I've been waiting for you to ask." So she and her sister moved there, and later her mother and her brother moved there. And Faye and her sister Virginia became Yogananda's confidential secretaries. Were with him for years. They typed his letters, they answered the telephone, they arranged his appointments, they passed word from him to others in the organization about what he wanted to have done. And they were just a team, his right hand workers. And so it was, after many, many years, shortly before Master passed. He passed in 1952 in March. But shortly before he passed, he was talking with Dayamata and about the future of the work, as he called it. And he said, "You are the one I have chosen to guide this ship into the future." And she said, "No, I don't want the responsibility." And he said, "I've had it all of these years, now it's your turn." So Mr. Lin was Master's choice to succeed him as president of the organization, which he did in 1952 when Master passed. But then when Mr. Lin passed in 1955, then Fei became the president, and she remained the president from 1955 until the year 2000, when she passed at the age of 96. And over the years, I maintained close contact with her because I had first met her the night I met Master in 1949. And after he passed, she was the one I interacted with because I was appointed to be the minister of the church, SRF Center in Phoenix after Master passed. In fact, Master passed on March 7th, and they had the memorial service or the funeral service at SRF headquarters in the middle of the following week. And the very next day, Faye invited me into her office and gave me my minister's certificate. Master had ordained me 5 months earlier, but she said then, she said, "It's Master's wish that you be the minister at the Phoenix Center." So that's how I became the minister there. And I was there for the next 2 years all by myself. Again, it was a beautiful experience because I liked seclusion. I had full time to devote to my spiritual practices. I only had a Sunday morning and a Thursday evening service to conduct, occasional phone calls. I had to mow the grass and maintain the building, of course, but I had my own private monastery there for 2 years. And I went over to Los Angeles for special events like summer convocations and Christmas meditation and so on. But the rest of the time, for those 2 years, in 1952 and 53, I was alone as the minister of the Phoenix Center. And that was Master's plan for me. I remember I visited him at his desert retreat facility on one occasion, and he said to me, "Be patient, Roy, I have plans for you." He never told me what the plans were, but he had plans and let me know through Faye what the plans were. Faye and Virginia were always with him when he was, except when he was by himself, but they were the ones who, I mentioned earlier, typed his letters and manuscripts and just gave him full support. They were always there to help him accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. And then there was another person who came along years later who became part of that team, and that was Myrna Brown, who came into the work when she was in her 9th grade in high school, and later became, after Dayamata passed, by that time she had the name Dayamata, the monastic name, given to her by one of the Shankacharyas in India many years before. But when she passed in 2000, then Myrna became the president and is now the president at this time, and her monastic name is Myrnalini. But those three were with him all the time when I was there. He was very gracious with guests who came. He frequently invited people to come to see him, and sometimes special people that he would invite and he would prepare or have prepared under his supervision, a meal usually with Indian flavored foods, and very, very attentive to their needs. And sometimes if the guests were really interested in him and the teaching, he would keep them for hours, way into the night, way after midnight. And Dayamata told me a story about his thoughtfulness. There was a Swami in Los Angeles area who was also from the same part of India that Master had come from, Bengal, up just north of Calcutta. And they used to get together from time to time. Master would go to his ashram and they would have a meal together, and then Master would invite him up to a sort of headquarters and have a meal together and sit around and talk, and they enjoyed each other's company. And Dayamata told me, she said, whenever that Swami was scheduled to come and have supper with Master, he always reminded us to have a separate saucer by his plate, by the Swami's plate, so he could have his after dinner cigarette. So that was back in the days, you didn't put up a sign saying no smoking. No one smoked when I was there, and we didn't have any smoking or drinking or cussing or carrying on. But if Master knew someone that he invited had a habit of that kind, back in those days, he would provide for that. And so there was no sense of being judgmental about it. So he was always very gracious. He counted the disciples' birthdays from the time that they met him. And I remember I met him at Christmas time, 1949, so right after that was January, and January 5th was his birthday, and we always met with him in the chapel of the headquarters building for a while, and then after we had a meal with him. And so a year later, in 1951, we were in the chapel and had meditated with him, and he was just talking informally. And he looked over and saw me off to one side where the fellows, where the male monastics were sitting. And he said, "Oh, Roy is 1 year old now." So I'm only 67 years old now. Herbert Freed, who was the minister who preceded me at the Phoenix SRF Center, told me in a story that he had been visiting Master. It was his time to be in California for a few days. And at that time, it must have been in the summer, late summer of 1950, because Master was at that time supervising the planting of trees and bushes and shrubs on the Lake Shrine property out there and near Santa Monica. And he asked Herbert to go with him. So usually someone else drove the car. Master didn't drive. He sat in the back seat of his car, and he had Herbert go with him so they could talk. And they went to a nursery to buy some plants for the Lake Shrine. And they went, and Herbert told me that the owner was from a Lebanese gentleman. And so he and Master talked about various things and became acquainted. Then they walked around, and Master picked out some shrubs and some small bushes and some little trees and so on. And he asked for the price, and whenever he got the price, he would say, "Oh, you have to come down a little bit on that one, or you have to throw in this, and this too." And they went back and forth like this in a friendly fashion. And after they finished, the Lebanese gentleman shook his hand and said, "Mr. Yogananda, I've enjoyed this very much. Please come back whenever you want to." And Herbert told me later, he said, "I grew up in the streets of Los Angeles, and I've seen wheeling and dealing, but Master embarrassed me." He had never seen this kind of carrying on before. But another time, I remember Master came in from late at night after Christmas. Someone had given him some personal money to spend, and usually he didn't really want anyone to give him things for Christmas, not even money. He usually said, "If you're going to give money, give it to the organization." Well, someone gave him a little bit of money. So he went down with Faye in Virginia, and Virginia always drove the car for him. And they went down to Hollywood, and he found a set of canes, Czechoslovakian canes that were carved, a matched set of canes. And just for some reason, at that time, he was using a cane now and then. He had had some difficulty with his knees. And he showed, and I was there when his car came in by the side of the building, and another fellow was there, another disciple. And Master was in a very happy mood, and he showed us his canes, his treasure. And he said, I got them at a very good price, and he was very, very happy with his purchase. And I could see Faye and Virginia in the front seat just smiling because they had witnessed this transaction. And then, after a few minutes, Master said to Faye, don't we have an extra carpet in the storeroom that might fit his living room? And she said, I think we do. He said, have the boys take it down as a gift tomorrow. So that was a part of his personality. He enjoyed having fun and making these purchases, but he also made sure the other person came out well in one way or another. And in the 20s, in the 50s rather, when they decorated the new buildings that they had constructed, much of the furniture that looked very nice had been purchased in used furniture stores and refinished by some of the monastics. So it was brand new and sparkling and in good shape. But of course, you buy it at a used store, you get it very cheaply. You don't have to spend much money, but you can fix it up yourself and make it look quite nice. Yes, he loved to have the grounds beautiful all the time. Flower gardens, and the grass had to be mowed, and the sidewalks had to be swept, and the entrance roads had to be swept clean. And even today, people who visit the SRF headquarters and also the Lake Shrine and also Encinitas Retreat, 25 miles north of San Diego, they are very much impressed with the landscaping. Everything is just beautiful. One time I was with him with a few of the other fellows and just having conversation, talk back and forth. And one of the fellows asked, Sir, what did Sri Yukteswar, your guru, what did he do for you? And Master said, he made me what I am. He said, when I went to him, he said it was very difficult at first, for the first several months, because he said he was very strict. And of course, if people who've read Autobiography of a Yogi or know that Master, when he was very young, was very impulsive and extremely devotional. And Yukteswar was just the opposite. He was very strict and rational. He had a devotional nature, but it wasn't emotional devotion. It was reverence and respect for the spiritual path and for saints, but he was very strict. But Master told us, he said, I told my guru, I said, you will never get rid of me, no matter how many times you discipline me. He said, you will never get rid of me. And then he said to us, he said, I needed that training to balance my personality to prepare me to come to America. So he paid respect. He paid respect to his guru and said, he did exactly what needed to be done in my case to get me prepared for this work. Master sometimes said, in regard to his plans for the growth of the work of the organization for the purpose of serving people, he sometimes said, I chew off more than I can chew, and then I chew it. So sometimes at board meetings, when he would tell the members of the board of the organization that he had the plans of building a new building or some project that was going to cost a considerable amount of money, whoever was in charge of the bookkeeping would say, sir, we don't have the funds. We can't go forward with that right now. And he would say, God told me to do it. And he didn't mean that God had whispered in his ear, but he meant he was inspired to do this because it would be useful for people to have it done. And then he would say, we can start. We don't need the money to start. We can begin. And then the money always came in. Sometimes it was slow coming in, but it always came in, and his projects were always completed. But he didn't hesitate just because the funds weren't immediately available. I don't know how many people that Yogananda authorized to initiate over the years, probably several dozen over the years. I remember when he authorized me to initiate, I was visiting him in Los Angeles with Herbert Freed, the minister from Phoenix, was with me. And we'd been there 3 or 4 days, must have been around Thanksgiving time. And in late November, and this was in 1951. And we were down at the side entrance of the building when his car came in, and he got out and he saw Herbert and I standing there, and he said, "Come with me, boys." And we went down the hallway to the elevator, went upstairs with him, and in the hallway upstairs, he sat in the chair, and Herbert stood in front of him, and I stood at his left. And first he talked to Herbert about the Phoenix Center, and asked to be remembered to some of the members that he had met, whom he had met a couple of years before, 3 years before, when he dedicated the center. And then he turned to me, and it seemed almost like an afterthought. He said, "Oh, kneel down," just like that. And so I knelt by his chair, and he put his hands on my head, and he said, "I ordain you a minister of self-realization. Heal as I have healed, teach as I have taught, and initiate devotees of God into Kriya Yoga." And Herbert was observing this, and he knew as well as I did that at that time there were only 2 or 3 ministers who were authorized to initiate people other than Yogananda. And so Herbert asked Master, he said, "Sir, is Roy to initiate people?" And Master said, "You too. The same God who is in me is in you, and what I have done you should do." So that's how he was with working with disciples. When they were ready to represent him and the tradition, he would say, "Do it." So I don't know how many that he authorized over the years. There must have been many. And many dropped away, and then many passed on, of course. But the authorization or permission to initiate from the Guru is important in the yoga tradition because it means that that person who is authorized to initiate and to represent the tradition is a link in the lineage of gurus, so that when the embodied guru departs the physical plane, disciples are out there representing the tradition, and so they become gurus or teachers, teacher representatives. I didn't initiate anyone after I was given permission to do so for 3 or 4 years, because I had to be more mature and more knowledgeable. Yeah, but eventually I began. So probably in the past 60 years, I've initiated probably 20,000 people worldwide. Many of them have passed on because they were older than I was when I knew them. And of course, a certain percentage have drifted away. But quite a few have stayed regular with their practices. And in the yoga tradition, it's understood that the transmission of the teaching goes from teacher to student, and from that, or qualified students to their students, and from those qualified students to their students. And it's other than it's not a formal organization matter. It's although they may work within an organization, but it's the spiritual transmission from one to another through the generations. And so I've been doing this for many years, and from time to time I have thought, how interesting it is that I grew up on a farm in Ohio. I read Yogananda's book when I was 18, had the privilege of knowing him and having his support and encouragement and spiritual help. And now here I am representing the Guru, this tradition. It must be God's grace or destiny, because when I shouted out, I didn't plan this. I was always open to the possibility, willing to serve and to share, but I didn't. When I first went to Master, I didn't go with the idea that in a few years I'm going to be a teacher. That just wasn't part of the process. With him and also with other gurus who are competent, a student goes, becomes a disciple or a learner, and when they're ready, then the teacher says, "Now you can share this with others." And some do, some have that capacity or that ability, and others don't. So you can't just go be a teacher of this tradition in 4 or 5 years of study. It just doesn't work. There has to be a deeper spiritual connection there. Whenever I visited Master in California during my visits in 1950, 51, he invariably would tell me just before I got ready to leave and go back to Phoenix, he would invariably say, "Now you stay in tune with me, because when you're in tune with me, I can help you. And when you're not in tune, it's like having static in the mental radio." And people ask me, what does he mean by attunement? Well, it's like with anyone you respect and love, you think of them with good feelings, and you have a feeling of warmth and closeness, even when you're not with them physically. So you have a spiritual and mental connection. Even though you're not physically together, you are still one in mind and spirit. And I was able to experience it when I was over in Phoenix, 300 miles away from him, physically, that I could just think of him, and it was just like he was there with me. And I still have that awareness today. So, and he assured me that was the way our relationship was, because I remember on one occasion, the first year I was with him, I was walking around the property at his retreat house in 29 Palms, and the one question I asked on my own, I asked if I had been with him before. Every new disciple wants to know if they've been with the Guru before. I remember he said, "Of course you have, many times. How could you be with me now if you weren't with me before?" And then he said, "You almost died last year. The previous year I had rheumatic fever and was very ill for 5 months." He said, "You almost died last year, but your love for God pulled you through." And it was during that time that I read his book and resolved to go to California to meet him when I got well. And he said, almost like he was caught by surprise, and the insight had just come into his mind, and he said, "You died young last time too, but he said you have a new life now, and you must make the most of it." So he was always with me. He always provided that feeling of confidentiality and warmth and closeness and reassurance. And that's just how he was. Of course, Yogananda was a visionary in that he was always open to having guidance, really, or of how to spread the work more effectively, reach more people in a positive way. He had a lot of willpower, of course, but he also was open to guidance, and he wanted to do the right thing all the time. But he just didn't sit around daydreaming. He always had pictures in his mind of possibilities, and I heard him say on more than one occasion, that I sow my desires in the ethers, and they must come into manifestation. That was his idea. He put them in the ether, and they would have to materialize. I talked with him in 1951 privately one evening in his room at Self-Realization Fellowship headquarters, and he told me then about the dedication of the lake shrine. And he said right above it there was property that didn't come with the property that was given to us. And I asked Mr. Lin to buy it. He said that was the first time I ever asked him to spend money for the organization. But Mr. Lin did buy it. And he said even then, Master said, back in 1951, 51, he said, one day there will be a beautiful temple here. Well, in the 1990s, a beautiful temple was built on that site on the hill above the lake. But Master had that in his mind in 1950, and it didn't come into manifestation until 40 years later. But he picked Dayamata as the right choice to be the president of the organization, as he said, to guide the ship into the future, because he had talked to her and her sister and a few others about his plans for the future. Dayamata, after Master passed, Dayamata sent me a letter one time with a carbon copy of some of the meetings of the last meeting of the board of directors with Yogananda when he was still embodied. And he had given them his plans for the spread of the work into the future. And over the years, much of what he wanted done has been done. And that's largely because of Faye Wright, later Dayamata, because she knew what Master's wishes were, and she saw to it that they were fulfilled. One of the things he said at that time, he said, build in California first, and then go out from there. Train teachers to go out into the world. But he said, keep autobiography of a yogi highly visible in bookstores, and advertise it in mass circulation magazines at least 4 times a year. And they have done this consistently. And now that book, Autobiography of a Yogi, has been published in 35 languages, and 15 other languages are being prepared for publication. And I don't know how many millions of copies have sold. 2 or 3 years ago, they were selling 50,000 copies a year in the United States, year after year after year. And that's the kind of vision he had. He was very practical, because he said that book is the best contact we have with the public. People who read the book either respond to it or they don't. But many people read it and they say, wow, and it gets them started. I've talked to many religious science and unity ministers and independent meditation teachers, and they've said, I got my start reading Autobiography of a Yogi. So he was very practical, and he knew what would work. But Dayamata was the one who made sure that all of these plans were fulfilled. Well, what impressed me most about Master was his being. He was always, to me, he was always self-realized, God-conscious, established in that. And as we've talked, he could, he enjoyed the things like landscaping and interacting with people socially in a quiet way. But there was always this awareness that he was grounded in something that was very big. He was just an embodiment of that. And you couldn't be with him very long without becoming aware of the fact that you were in the presence of someone who was very spiritually conscious and strong, and really very strong. It's not quite the same, naturally, without Master there, because his personal presence pervaded everything. And when he was on the grounds on the property, there was a different feeling in the air. Oh, Master's here! You could feel it, like his aura was spread out there, you know. And so it's one thing to have the memory of the Master, but to have the Master's physical presence is something else. Well, he's the product, as he said, of his number one, of his destiny, also his past, because as a boy, his parents were disciples of Paramahansa, a great yogi in Benares, who was a disciple of Mahavadar Babaji in the Himalayas. So Master's parents were disciples of Paramahansa, and they were practiced meditation. And his father instructed him in meditation practice, and then later his Sanskrit tutor gave him more advanced instruction. So as a young boy, from the age of 12 and 13, he was meditating long hours in the seclusion of the attic room in his family house in Calcutta. And then, as he grew up, he met other saintly people and visited temples and places of pilgrimage, and then he met his guru and had 10 years of training with him. So it's just that he said one time when one of the fellows said, "Sir," when he gave someone some advice, and the person said, "Sir, it's easier for you to say that because you're the Master." And the Master said, "How do you think I got to be what I am? I did it because I did the work." In other words, he did what had to be done to become the person that he was. Yogananda made a strong impression on the world because, number one, he was very intentional. He knew exactly what his mission was, and he was determined to make it known, and always with the idea of serving people. But as I mentioned earlier, he had a lot of willpower, but also a lot of faith, and also the willingness to get into action and do what had to be done to accomplish his purposes. He wasn't lazy by any means. In fact, in his later years, he spent a lot of time with people who visited him. Really took his time, but and I wish at times he would spend more time by himself in his later years, seeing to his health and his energy. But he was always putting himself out for people. Long hours, always doing something for other people. And then, of course, toward the end of his earth life, as Dayamata and Virginia have shared, that he worked very long hours finishing his writing projects, commentary on the Bhagavad Gita and other books that he wanted to finish. And he would tell them, "We must do this now. There isn't much time." And he was conscious of the fact that he wouldn't be around for a long time, and he had a lot of projects to finish before he left. And in fact, the Bhagavad Gita that he wrote an extensive commentary on the text was not published until many years after he passed. And although he had written commentaries for many years, from the 1920s onward, that were published in their magazine in serialized form. But then at the desert retreat in 1551, he went through the Gita completely and reorganized what he had written and added to it. And so it came out to 1,500 pages. And I remember at his birthday gathering in 1952, just a month and a few days before he passed, he said of the Gita, he said, "A new scripture has been born, and you will see it when it is published next year." That was the way he thought. I've done it, it's done, and let's get it published next year. Well, there was nobody who could edit 1,500 pages adequately in a year's time, especially a book of that nature. And so it took several years for it to be finished, but finally came out in the 1990s, which I thought was a little extremely late. But anyway, finally got out. But he finished it before he passed. One of the remarkable things about his life and work is that it has continued to grow and to be influential around the world. There are more people today aware of what he taught and have access to his teachings than ever before. It keeps on growing and growing and growing. Of course, in our current era, there are increasing numbers of people who are becoming more receptive to these teachings. And then, of course, the fact that he trained Dayamata and others and told them how to present the work into the future. But someone asked him one time, why does the autobiography of a yogi change so many lives? And he said, because my spirit is in it. And I think that's the key there. That for those who are receptive to his way of presenting the yoga philosophy, you have to be receptive to really get it. But to those who are receptive, they also get his spirit. And that's the transformative influence. Many people don't understand that. They can't even explain it. They say, I just feel different when I read Yogananda's writings or when I think of him or I see his picture. But they don't know that they are picking up on the spirit of his consciousness. And that's transformative. And that will continue. But it also continues to be transmitted through some of his disciples and their disciples and so forth.